The airport was buzzing with activity, a constant flow of travelers moving in every direction. The sound of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and muffled airport announcements filled the air. Among the sea of passengers stood Amara, a young black woman with deep brown skin and radiant curls that framed her face. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and let out a small sigh, excitement dancing in her dark eyes. This was supposed to be a special day, a day of celebration. She had just graduated with honors from law school, and her father had gifted her a first-class ticket for this trip, a small way to reward her years of dedication and hard work. As she clutched her boarding pass, she couldn't help but smile. Everything about today felt right. But the moment she stepped forward to board the plane, the energy shifted. A flight attendant, a tall woman with neatly pinned blonde hair and a forced smile, glanced at Amara's ticket before her expression tightened. "I'm sorry, miss," she said in a voice that held no warmth. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Amara blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Yes, I know. That's my seat." She held up her ticket, her confidence unwavering. The attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "There must be a mistake." Her gaze flickered over Amara's designer outfit, her expensive shoes, everything that screamed she belonged in first class. But there was something else in her eyes. Something unspoken, yet heavy. Amara's stomach tightened. She had seen this look before. "I can assure you there's no mistake," Amara said, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I paid for this seat." A couple behind her shifted uncomfortably. A man in a business suit let out an impatient sigh. The line wasn't moving, and people were starting to notice. The flight attendant's smile thinned. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor. Please step aside." Amara exhaled, heat creeping up her neck. She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but she also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. With a deep breath, she moved to the side, her fingers tightening around her phone. The other passengers continued to board without issue. No questions. No hesitation. Just her. Minutes passed before the supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. The flight attendant handed him Amara's ticket as if it were evidence in a trial. "She claims she has a first-class seat, but there must be some mistake." The supervisor barely looked at the ticket before his brows furrowed. "This is a valid first-class ticket." He turned to the flight attendant, confused. "What's the issue?" The woman hesitated, suddenly unsure of herself. I wasn't aware we had any." She stopped herself, but the damage was done. Amara felt something inside her twist. She knew exactly what the flight attendant had been about to say. The supervisor cleared his throat and forced a smile. "I apologize, ma'am. Please, go ahead and board." Amara's fingers tightened around her bag, her heart pounding. She had been singled out, questioned, humiliated in front of an entire line of people. But instead of letting anger consume her, she let out a slow breath and walked past the attendant without another word. She took her seat in first class, still feeling the sting of what had just happened. She wanted to let it go, to move on and enjoy the flight. But what she didn't know was that this moment would change everything. Because what the flight attendant had failed to realize, what no one on this flight knew, was that Amara's father wasn't just another businessman. He was the owner of the entire airline. Amara settled into her plush first-class seat, but the comfort did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She stared out the window, watching the runway lights blur as she replayed the incident over in her mind. She had experienced subtle discrimination before, sideways glances, hesitant service, assumptions about what she could or couldn't afford, but this time it felt more direct, more personal. She inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the feeling. Today was supposed to be a celebration. Her father had surprised her with this ticket as a gift, telling her it was his way of showing how proud he was. "You deserve the best, Amara," he had said over the phone. Always. And yet, here she was, having to prove she belonged in a space she had every right to be in. A soft chime rang through the cabin as other first-class passengers settled into their seats. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and warm towels. The same woman who had questioned Amara now seemed to avoid looking in her direction, her smile reserved for the other passengers. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted Amara's thoughts. She turned to see an older woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace seated across from her. She was elegantly dressed, the kind of woman who exuded quiet wealth. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back there," the woman said, her expression kind but curious. Amara gave a small, polite smile. "It was nothing." The woman arched a brow. "It didn't seem like nothing." Amara hesitated. She didn't know this woman, and she wasn't sure she wanted to unpack her frustration with a stranger. But there was something in the woman's gaze, something that told Amara she had seen this kind of thing before. "It's just frustrating," Amara admitted, "to be questioned like that. To be treated as if I don't belong." The woman nodded slowly. "It never really changes, does it?" she said, almost to herself. Amara tilted her head. "You've been through something like this?" The woman gave a knowing smile. "More times than I can count. It used to bother me more, but then I realized, people's assumptions don't define me. I define me." Amara let those words sink in. Before she could respond, the flight attendant returned, her smile tight as she handed Amara a glass of sparkling water. "Let us know if you need anything," she said, her voice strained. It was clear she was still processing the fact that Amara was in first class. Amara accepted the drink, offering nothing more than a curt nod. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and a buzz of excitement rippled through the cabin as passengers settled in for the flight. But Amara couldn't shake the unease lingering in her chest. She reached for her phone and sent a quick text to her father. "Amara, just boarded. I'll call when I land. Thanks again for the ticket." She didn't mention the incident. She didn't want to ruin the moment. A few seconds later, her phone vibrated with a reply. "Dad. Enjoy the flight, sweetheart. Proud of you." She smiled slightly, tucking her phone away. As the plane lifted off, Amara leaned back in her seat, trying to relax. But just as she began to drift into her thoughts, she overheard a conversation a few rows ahead. "I don't understand why they let just anyone into first class these days," a man murmured, his voice low but not low enough. "I know," another voice replied. "It's supposed to be exclusive. Standards seem to be slipping." Amara's fingers tightened around her armrest. She knew they were talking about her. She exhaled slowly, refusing to let them see that their words affected her. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their assumptions were about to be shattered in a way they never expected. Amara clenched her jaw, pretending not to hear the hushed voices a few rows ahead. The ignorance in their words was nothing new, but knowing she was being judged in a space she rightfully belonged in made it sting in a different way. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she wasn't here for them. She was here to enjoy a well-earned trip, a gift from her father, a man who had worked harder than anyone she knew to build a life where moments like this were possible for her. Still, the tension in her chest refused to fade. A flight attendant moved past, handing out menus for the meal service. Amara took hers and glanced over the options, but she had little appetite. She was too aware of the glances, the whispered conversations, the subtle way people shifted in their seats as if her presence somehow disrupted the atmosphere of exclusivity they expected. Then, the man seated across the aisle caught her eye. He was in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a navy blue suit, and had the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to people listening when he spoke. Unlike the others, he wasn't whispering. He was speaking at a normal volume, almost like he wanted her to hear. "You know, first class used to mean something," he said to the man beside him, barely glancing in Amara's direction. "Back when airlines actually cared about who they let in." The other man chuckled under his breath. Now they just hand out seats like candy. Reward programs, upgrades, some rich boyfriend buying tickets for his girl. Who knows anymore? Amara felt a rush of heat flood her face. She turned her head, staring out the window, willing herself to ignore them. She had dealt with ignorance before, but something about this moment, in this space, made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't quite explain. She could have spoken up, could have told them exactly who she was, but she knew that wouldn't change anything. People like them didn't see past their assumptions. Instead, she let her mind drift back to her father. She remembered sitting in his office as a little girl, swinging her feet while he worked behind his massive wooden desk, running numbers, taking calls, making decisions that kept an entire airline running. At the time, she hadn't understood the weight of it all. She had just thought it was amazing that her dad owned planes. "You see that, Amara?" he had said one evening, pointing to a framed newspaper clipping on the wall. It was an old article about how he had built the airline from the ground up, a man who had started with nothing and created an empire. That's what happens when you never let the world tell you where you do or don't belong. She had carried those words with her ever since. And yet, in moments like this, it still hurt. The older woman across from her, the one who had spoken to her earlier, must have sensed the shift in her mood. She gave Amara a knowing look before turning toward the men across the aisle. "Funny," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "I was just thinking how much first class has improved. It's nice to see it's no longer just an old boys' club." The man in the navy suit blinked, caught off guard. "I beg your pardon?" The woman smiled politely. "I was simply agreeing with you. First class used to mean something, and now it means something better." Amara felt the corners of her lips twitch, just slightly. The man muttered something under his breath and turned his attention back to his drink, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation now that it wasn't going his way. The woman winked at Amara before returning to her book. The rest of the flight settled into a quiet hum. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, refilling glasses and adjusting blankets. The lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised smoothly through the sky. But just as Amara finally started to relax, a soft chime rang over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to extend a special welcome to one of our valued guests flying with us today." Amara barely registered the announcement at first, assuming it was just a routine message. But then, the captain's next words made her freeze. "We are honored to have Mr. Elias Carter's daughter on board with us today. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Carter is the founder and owner of this airline, and we couldn't be prouder to have his family flying with us. On behalf of the entire crew, Miss Carter, we thank you for choosing to fly with us." A stunned silence fell over first class. Amara felt every set of eyes turned toward her at once. The same flight attendant who had questioned her at the gate looked as if she wanted to disappear. The men across the aisle, who had been so quick to judge, now stared at her with wide eyes, their previous arrogance melting into shock. Amara didn't move, didn't speak. She simply reached for her glass, took a slow sip of water, and let them sit with the weight of what they had just learned. The weight of the silence pressed down on the cabin like an unexpected storm. Amara could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tension rippling through first class. A moment ago, she had been an outsider in their eyes, someone they had whispered about, dismissed, questioned. Now, everything had changed. The man in the navy blue suit, the one who had so confidently suggested that first class had lost its exclusivity, sat frozen in his seat. His fingers curled around the stem of his wine glass, but he didn't take another sip. The smugness that had lined his face earlier was gone, replaced with something else, discomfort, maybe even embarrassment. The flight attendant who had doubted Amara's ticket stood stiffly a few rows away, her eyes darting toward her but never quite meeting her gaze. Her posture had changed, no longer carrying the quiet confidence she'd had when she first blocked Amara at the gate. Amara should have felt satisfaction in watching their reactions, but instead, she felt something else, a deep, quiet understanding of what this moment truly was. It wasn't just about her being right. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about the way the world worked, how people placed value on status, on wealth, on names. If she had been anyone else, if her father hadn't owned the airline, would she have ever gotten the apology she deserved? Or would they have carried on believing what they wanted to believe, treating her as if she had somehow slipped through the cracks into a space she didn't belong? The woman across from her, the one who had spoken up earlier, gave her a small, knowing smile. She didn't say anything, but Amara understood the message in her eyes. Moments like these were both a victory and a reminder. The flight attendant finally moved, hesitating before making her way toward Amara's seat. Her smile, which had been forced before, was now carefully measured. "Miss Carter," she said softly, as if saying her name out loud might undo the way she had treated her earlier. "Can I get you anything? Another drink? A blanket?" The words were different, but Amara recognized what was happening. The sudden change in tone. The eager-to-please attitude. It wasn't about respect. It was about realization. Amara didn't smile. She simply met the woman's gaze and shook her head. "I'm fine." The flight attendant nodded quickly and stepped away, disappearing toward the galley as if she couldn't escape fast enough. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit finally spoke, his voice lower than before. I didn't realize," he muttered. Amara turned her head slightly, raising a brow. "Didn't realize what?" The man cleared his throat. "Who your father is." Amara let his words hang in the air for a moment before responding, her voice calm but firm. "Would it have made a difference?" The man shifted uncomfortably. He didn't answer. She already knew the truth. The rest of the flight carried on with an unspoken tension lingering in the air. The whispers had died down, but the weight of the moment remained. People weren't sure how to act around her now. Some tried to steal glances, as if seeing her in a new light. Others pretended nothing had happened at all. Amara kept her composure, but inside, her mind was racing. She had been raised to understand that power shifted perception. That people who once dismissed you would scramble to adjust their attitudes the moment they realized you held something they respected. Money, influence, a name they recognized. She should have been used to it. But tonight, something about it unsettled her more than usual. She could feel it building, a tension rising like a wave about to crash. This wasn't over yet. Amara kept her gaze steady, but her mind raced. The weight of the moment lingered, pressing against her as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, unsure how to move forward. The people who had once dismissed her now sat in uneasy silence, trying to process their own embarrassment. But just when she thought the tension had reached its peak, something happened that shifted everything once again. A sharp chime rang through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified of an unexpected issue. Due to an urgent security concern, we need to divert our flight. We are currently coordinating with ground control and will update you as soon as possible. We appreciate your patience." A ripple of confusion spread through first class. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, whispers picking up again. This time, not about Amara, but about what was happening with the flight. Amara's pulse quickened. A security concern? She sat up straighter, her mind racing with possibilities. The flight attendants moved quickly, their expressions carefully neutral, but Amara caught the way they exchanged glances, the slight tension in their movements. Something was wrong. The man across the aisle, the same one who had looked down on her earlier, finally broke his silence. "Security concern?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "They're probably overreacting. This airline has been going soft for years." Amara clenched her jaw, biting back a response. It wasn't worth engaging with him. But then, her phone vibrated. She pulled it out, expecting to see a message from her father, but what she saw made her breath catch. "Dad." "Amara, listen to me. Stay calm." The airline received an anonymous threat right before takeoff. I don't have all the details yet, but they're taking it seriously. Don't panic. I'll handle this. A chill ran down her spine. Anonymous threat. She read the words again, her fingers tightening around her phone. This wasn't just a minor security issue. This was something bigger. Something dangerous. The whispers around her grew louder as people tried to make sense of what was happening. The flight attendants were still moving through the cabin, their smiles strained as they reassured passengers that everything was under control. Amara's mind raced. Why had her father contacted her directly? And why had the airline still allowed the plane to take off if there had been a threat? Then, another thought struck her. Was this about her? She swallowed hard, glancing around the cabin. Had someone on this flight known who she was before the captain's announcement? Had the threat been made because of her? Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to stay composed. If her father had told her to stay calm, it meant he was already working behind the scenes. But that didn't make the fear disappear. She could feel the eyes on her again, but this time, they weren't filled with judgment or curiosity. Now they carried something else. Uncertainty. Fear. The flight attendants moved toward the cockpit, disappearing behind the curtain. The older woman across from Amara leaned in slightly. "You okay, dear?" Her voice was steady, but Amara could see the concern in her eyes. Amara forced a small nod, though her throat felt tight. "Yeah. Just trying to figure out what's going on." The woman studied her for a moment before nodding. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it." Amara wished she could believe that as easily as the woman made it sound. She checked her phone again, but there were no new messages. Her father had told her to stay calm, but how could she, when the entire flight was now on edge? The plane was still cruising at altitude, but the tension inside the cabin had changed. People weren't whispering about social status or money anymore. Now, everyone had the same question. What was really happening on this flight? Amara's heart pounded as she reread her father's message. The weight of the words pressed down on her, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Around her, the tension in the cabin had shifted, no longer centered on her but on the uncertainty looming over them all. The flight attendants moved with a forced calm, their smiles strained as they reassured passengers, but Amara could see it in their eyes. They were just as unsettled as everyone else. Then, the plane began to descend. Passengers stiffened in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. The man in the navy blue suit, who had spent most of the flight treating Amara like she didn't belong, now looked uneasy. He drummed his fingers against the armrest, his confidence cracking under the weight of the unknown. A soft chime rang through the cabin before the captain's voice returned, steadier than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed to make an emergency landing at a secure location. We appreciate your cooperation and will update you as soon as we receive more information." Secure location. The word sent a fresh wave of unease through Amara's chest. This wasn't just a precaution. Something serious was happening. Her phone buzzed again. "Dad. Stay alert. Authorities are waiting on the ground. We don't know who made the threat, but they may be on the plane." A chill ran down her spine. Someone on this flight. She swallowed hard and forced herself to scan the cabin. Every face looked tense, nervous, but no one stood out. The whispers had died down, replaced with a heavy silence. If the person responsible was among them, they were doing a good job of blending in. The plane continued its descent, and Amara's fingers curled around the armrest as she tried to steady her breath. The older woman across from her gave her a reassuring nod, as if sensing her tension. Minutes felt like hours. Then, the wheels touched down. The plane slowed, the cabin still eerily quiet. Outside the window, Amara could see flashing lights, emergency vehicles lined up along the tarmac. Something about the scene sent another jolt of adrenaline through her veins. Before anyone could move, a new voice echoed over the intercom. this time firm and authoritative. "Attention, passengers. Law enforcement will be boarding the plane. Please remain in your seats." Murmurs broke out immediately. People shifted, glancing around in confusion. Amara's grip tightened on her phone. A few moments later, uniformed officers stepped onto the plane. Their expressions were unreadable as they moved methodically through the cabin, their eyes scanning the passengers. The energy in the air was electric, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, an officer stopped, right beside the man in the navy blue suit. The entire cabin seemed to freeze as the officer spoke, his voice even. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The man blinked, looking around as if expecting someone else to be called. "Me?" "Yes, sir," the officer said firmly. "Please stand up." A hush fell over the cabin as the man hesitated. He looked at the officers, at the other passengers, at Amara. Something flickered across his face. Shock, disbelief, and then something else. A brief moment of calculation. Then, suddenly he moved. Not toward the officers. Away. Chaos erupted as he shoved past the aisle, trying to make a run for it. Gasps filled the cabin as passengers recoiled, pressing against their seats. But the officers were faster. Within seconds, they had him pinned, his protests drowned out by the rush of movement. Amara's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the scene unfold. She had expected tension. She had expected whispers and judgment. But this was something else entirely. The officers secured the man's hands behind his back, their movements precise and controlled. "Sir, you are under arrest for making a false threat against this flight." A stunned silence filled the cabin. The man struggled for a moment before his shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him. But it was his next words that sent a shockwave through Amara. "I wasn't serious," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I just wanted to prove a point." Amara's stomach turned. She knew exactly what that meant. He hadn't made the threat because of money or politics or some grand scheme. He had done it because of what had happened earlier. Because he had felt entitled to a space that, in his mind, someone like Amara didn't deserve. And when the reality had shattered his illusion, he had lashed out in the most reckless way possible. The officers didn't give him a chance to say anything else. They hauled him toward the exit, his protests fading as they led him off the plane. For a moment, the entire cabin remained frozen. Then, as the reality of what had just happened settled in, a low murmur spread through the passengers. Amara exhaled, her chest still tight with adrenaline. The woman across from her reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You okay, dear?" Amara nodded slowly, though the weight of everything still pressed against her. She had come onto this flight expecting nothing more than a simple journey. Instead, she had been forced to confront a truth she had known all along. People would always find reasons to doubt her, to challenge her presence in spaces they thought she didn't belong. But tonight, she had also seen something else, something stronger. She had seen the way perception could shift, the way truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how hard people tried to deny it. As the plane sat still on the runway, surrounded by flashing lights and murmuring passengers, Amara pulled out her phone. A new message from her father appeared on the screen. "Dad, I'm proud of you." She let out a slow breath, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Because, in the end, it wasn't just about proving she belonged. It was about knowing she always had. The murmurs in the cabin gradually softened as reality settled in. Some passengers still whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief, while others sat in stunned silence. The weight of what had just unfolded lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. The man who had once looked down on Amara had not only embarrassed himself but had put an entire flight of people at risk simply because of his own entitlement. Amara leaned back in her seat, letting out a long, steady breath. She could still feel the rush of adrenaline in her veins, but there was also a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had done nothing wrong, and yet, for a brief moment, she had questioned if she somehow had. But now, looking around at the people who had once judged her, she knew she had never been the problem. A flight attendant approached her seat, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret. "Miss, can I get you anything? Water? A blanket?" Amara shook her head, offering the woman a small smile. "I'm okay. Thank you." The woman hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. I should have handled things differently." Amara studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you for saying that." The flight attendant gave her a genuine, appreciative smile before stepping away to check on other passengers. The older woman across the aisle, who had been kind to Amara from the start, spoke again. "You handled yourself well, dear. Better than most would." Amara gave a soft chuckle. "I didn't really have a choice, did I?" The woman smiled knowingly. "No, I suppose you didn't." As the passengers continued to process everything, the pilot made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be delayed a little longer as we complete security procedures. We appreciate your patience." A few groans of frustration echoed throughout the cabin, but no one protested too much. The situation had been far from ordinary, and now, all they could do was wait. Amara glanced down at her phone. Her father had sent another message. "Dad, I'm at the airport. I'll see you as soon as they let you off the plane." She felt a sense of relief wash over her. No matter what had happened on this flight, she knew she wasn't alone. The minutes ticked by, but eventually, the passengers were allowed to deboard. As Amara stepped off the plane, she saw a group of security personnel still stationed near the gate. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles were visible through the large airport windows, but the chaos had begun to settle. Then, she spotted him. Her father stood near the security checkpoint, his sharp suit impeccable as always, but his expression was softer than usual. As soon as their eyes met, he strode toward her, his presence commanding yet full of warmth. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She nodded against his shoulder. "Yeah, it was a lot. But I'm okay." He pulled back slightly, studying her face. "I should have been there from the start." She shook her head. "You were there in the way that mattered." He exhaled deeply, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "The man responsible is being dealt with. And I made sure the airline is reviewing their policies. What happened today won't happen again." Amara looked up at him, a flicker of something resolute in her eyes. "It's not just about policies, Dad. It's about people. The way they see things. The way they react when they think someone doesn't belong." Her father nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "And the way we show them that we do." She offered a small smile. "Exactly." They walked through the terminal together, the tension of the last few hours beginning to ease. Around them, the airport buzzed with life. People coming and going, moving on to their next destinations. As they reached the exit, her father glanced at her. "You still want to fly first class next time?" Amara let out a soft laugh. "Absolutely." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's my girl." They stepped outside into the cool evening air, and for the first time since boarding that flight, Amara felt completely at peace. She had faced judgment, doubt, and even danger, but she had come out of it stronger. And as she looked up at the vast night sky, she knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. Because she did. She always had. And she always would.